I had one of those very rare Sunday mornings a few years ago when I was on vacation, but I was in Springfield. So I decided to indulge my curiosity as to exactly what goes on in our city's mega church, what we often fondly refer to as Six Flags Over Jesus. And a friend went with me who had no experience of Pentecostal churches. And I warned her, this is not going to be at all like the very reserved university Presbyterian church where you grew up, but she wanted to see it. So after we'd been there for nearly an hour, engaging in hypnotic, repetitious choruses that had like 3 or 4 words that you just kept singing over and over in a manner that I can only describe as being something like trying to empty the Pacific Ocean with a teaspoon. I was going crazy. But finally things got kicked up. Very large woman in a bright print dress started dancing up and down the aisles, kind of getting with it a little bit. And even the tempo of the music picked up at that point. And then a woman stood up and began speaking in tongues very loudly. So my little Presbyterian friend, who'd never seen any one of these things, thought perhaps we had gotten trapped in a loony bin. But I whispered a reassurance to her that it would soon be over and a man would stand up and interpret what the woman was saying in tongues. And it would probably be that God was very, very angry at all the women in the church for pretending that they were equals to their husbands. As luck would have it, I accurately called it seconds before it happened. In churches where women are deeply repressed, they're not allowed to serve on the board, they're not allowed to preach, to teach, or have any sort of religious leadership, their Pentecostal spiritual expressions provide a loophole of that gender bias. Women can interrupt a male-led service to dance, to speak to their heart's content. But in one of the rare biblical references to speaking in tongues, Paul insists that there must be an interpretation. So in my handful of experiences in such meetings, which, mind you, does not rise to the level of scientific research, the interpretations have inevitably been given by a man, and inevitably they represent the divine demand that women stop being so uppity. So the ladies get a little bit of liberation, immediately balanced by another spiritual punch in the face. Of course, I can't prove it, but it pleases me to think that the woman who spoke in tongues so enthusiastically is saying to herself, that's not at all what I was saying, you jackass, but of course I can't prove it, and of course you can't prove me wrong, and I've got a microphone, so it's better than a draw. I'm certain that my account of my experience there would sound like an insulting caricature in the ears of anyone who felt a genuine spiritual presence in such meetings. And it's not my goal to be just insulting, but rather to put our scripture reading from the 2nd chapter of Acts into a little bit more of a perspective, a context. You were not there the morning that I visited Six Flags Over Jesus, so you have no way of knowing exactly whether I'm exaggerating or giving you an accurate description. In much the same way, Luke wasn't there in Jerusalem to witness the account that he gives in the 2nd chapter of Acts. He's getting it at least secondhand, maybe thirdhand, and it is possibly a very exaggerated story. But Luke wants to write a theological account of the birth of the church. How did it all get started? And he places it in the midst of the Jewish festival of Pentecost. Now, if you notice at the end of Luke's gospel, he has Jesus rising into heaven on Easter Sunday, but by the time he's around to writing Acts, he's given this a good deal more thought. And so he says, Jesus makes appearances for 40 days. Same author, completely different story, but you understand Luke is a preacher, and I understand exaggeration for the purpose of making a good point. So he sets it up so Jesus appears for 40 days. That's got a nice ring with the 40 years of the wilderness. And then on the 50th day, the day of Pentecost, is the day that the church was born. And Pentecost was sort of a Jewish Mardi Gras. It was the spring harvest festival, so they blow the shofar, the priest is up on the walls waving new bread, and it sort of was a signal of an otherwise fairly reserved Jewish culture in which they were commanded to both feast and to get drunk. A Jewish man should not get drunk any day except for Pentecost, where it was sort of your duty. So you understand how this was a popular holiday. Lots of folks would be there. And in fact, Peter's only defense against the allegation that they were all just drunk, what did he say? I mean, look at the text. It's only 9 a.m. I mean, I don't know, David, unless you're German, 9 a.m. is just too early to be drunk. But I'm just talking about Oktoberfest. I don't mean everything, but Peter doesn't say we're not drinking. He says it's just too early to be drunk. Still, Luke is taking considerable liberty with the facts in order to construct a theological story of the birth of the church. Because in every other biblical account of speaking in tongues, the speech is entirely unintelligible. They call it the language of the angels. And the phenomenon is not only recorded in Pentecostal Christian settings, but in other emotionally charged services, in Islam, in Judaism, and other world religions. And interestingly enough, even, I don't know if you're the kind of person that watches Comedy Channel much, but Cat Williams, one of the African-American comedians who does a lot of dancing around in the midst of his performance, he will occasionally speak in tongues as he's dancing across the stage, which probably just flies over the head of anyone who's never been in a Pentecostal service, but it's sort of an inside joke between Cat Williams and his other formerly Pentecostal listeners. But Luke says that the disciples were not speaking in an incomprehensible way, that gibberish of consonant sounds that's usually speaking in tongues, but that they are in fact just suddenly speaking all of the languages of the world. Luke describes the birth of the church as being a dramatic restoration of an idealized time when there was only one people on earth, when everybody spoke only one language. And Luke is saying that the church itself, that its birth brings all of these disparate nations, all of these distant, separated people back into being one people. You remember the Genesis narrative about the Tower of Babel, where God destroyed this tower and then scattered the people of the world and confused their languages so that they couldn't understand each other. So Luke is setting that primeval history in Genesis as the first bookend of history and the birth of the church as the other bookend that restores that division. The first pages of the Bible gives all kinds of accounts of sin, of separation from God and from one another. There's the fall in the Garden of Eden and the expulsion from the garden, the murder of Abel by Cain, and then Cain is sent into exile. There's the flood, the Tower of Babel, and each one of those primeval accounts in the first 11 chapters of Genesis divides people, sets them apart, scatters them, increases the sin that exists within the world. Luke wants us then to see the birth of the church and the Jesus story as the beginning of putting the world back together. That now our warfare with God and our divisions among different nations and different languages can all be over, and we can all be reunited and get along. Of course, it didn't happen that way. Even Luke's account goes on to chronicle almost immediately the divisions between Jewish and Gentile Christians. And one of the ways you can tell the story of Christianity is by just looking at the conflicts, looking at the divisions that have left us in thousands of competing and critical pieces. The writing of the creeds were themselves a way of drawing the lines to say, if you think you're a Christian, then you've got to be inside this circle. You've got to believe exactly these things. And if you don't believe exactly these things, then we don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. The church has unwittingly supported racial divisions. We even supported slavery within most of the history of the church. It has kept women in subservient roles far longer in history than even in more secular societies. As much as Americans tend to want to believe that Middle Eastern and Muslim people oppress women, there have been many women who rose to positions of national leadership. We've yet to have a female president in the United States. So it's interesting how a religion that is fundamentally intended to unite and break down the walls of division between people has perpetuated keeping women in subservient roles. And even in the churches of our days, 21st century, in a church that's filled with universities and seminaries, still the overwhelming majority of churches in Springfield, women would not be allowed to take a leadership role. The church has historically defended child labor. The church has fought against labor unions. And recently, some churches have spent millions upon millions of dollars to deny equal rights to same-sex couples. And that is not in any way to deny the wonderful things done in the name of Christian faith by churches throughout the generations. But we've got to be honest about it. And for me, that balance between the good things that the church has accomplished and the really horrible things that the church has done began tipping through my 30 years of parish ministry towards an irreconcilable darkness. I left the ministry in 2007. My then teenage daughter asked me at the dinner table, "Do you think you'll ever go back to church?" And at that moment, I couldn't imagine that I could ever do it again. But I did keep trying. I went to a couple of the more liberal churches here in town, and I got to tell you, I was bored out of my mind. I was caught, reading my mail on my phone. So I visited some traditional churches where both my intellect and my values were insulted. I remember very clearly Christmas in 2007, getting dressed in suit and tie to go out to Christmas Eve service and couldn't think of anywhere to go. No place where I felt like I wouldn't either be offended or just bored. And I'm a church guy. I grew up going to church. My mother was our church secretary. I'd been in church 5, 6, 7 days a week all of my life. And that Christmas Eve, I couldn't do anything but lie on the bed and weep, wishing that I could be connected somehow. But I was a person of faith in exile. A handful of us decided that spring that none of us could find a place to go. And so we would try to start a church that we could actually support. And we did that. You have to admit, I'm not going to glorify our beginning the way Luke glorifies the beginning of the first church. What we did was largely personal. The first itch we wanted to scratch was our own itch. We couldn't find anywhere to go, so we did. We committed ourselves from the very beginning that we would be in service to the poor. But really, you have to admit that our services, when we first started, were really all to meet our own needs. We wanted a church where we could go, where we could bring our intellect inside, along with our question, that we could have our faith, but also have our doubts and not be diminished for that. We wanted to be a part of a community that wouldn't discriminate against anyone for their sexual orientation, their gender, their race, what they believed, or what they didn't believe. The birth of this church has always been an intention to do what I think Luke envisioned the church doing in the first place, which is to end division, to quiet the Babel sounds of segregation and discrimination. No more fear of hell. Nobody else has to go to hell. No more judgment. No more blood sacrifice. No neurotic guilt about our bodies or about just being human. No more forcing ourselves to act like we believe what is clearly irrational. And yet what we did not anticipate is that from this tiny upper room, this small church on the edge of Springfield, that we would come to a time where we would have an extended congregation, that we have people now who join us every week from China and in Russia, in Iran of all places, Indonesia, Canada, Brazil. I can do some analysis and I realize that we even have people joining us from Texas and Alabama. I never saw that coming. And so we begin to dare to wonder if we have started a church for ourselves where we can organize to do some service to the homeless who live around us, or are we in fact part of a movement that is inviting the Church Alumni Association to dare to believe again, to believe that divisions can be healed, the prejudice and racism can come to an end, the craziness that has been our past experience of church can be over. We dare now to speak of an emerging church, a church that will rise from the dust of the ashes of a dysfunctional, judgmental, superstitious, and divided graveyard of denominations. I say only this: let love be our only creed, and let our spiritual practice be living lives of radical compassion. And it is true that a smile means the same thing in every language. And it may very well be that everything past that is just commentary anyway.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverend.ray@aol.com for more information.